Welcome to Grief is the New Normal. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, a licensed psychologist and grief specialist, here to help change the conversation about grief and build community and connection while we all adjust to this new normal we are living in. This podcast is for you if you are grieving or if you are supporting someone in a season of grief. I'm glad you're here. Welcome back, everyone. Dr. Taylor here, flying solo today for this episode on November 18th, 2024, talking about Griefaversaries. The reason this is such an important topic for today is the 15-year anniversary of my brother passing. That's what November represents to me for the most part. I love Thanksgiving. I have some friends and cousins who have birthdays in this month, and they are very, very dear people to me. And so I'm grateful that they exist, and November is still a really hard month. On November 18th, 2009, that's the day my life changed. My younger brother died really suddenly, very unexpectedly, and I've never been the same. My family has never been the same. November kind of sucks. So today we're going to talk a bit about Griefaversaries, and I'm going to share more in depth about my story than I have so far. If any part of my sharing my story is activating for you, I encourage you to be kind to yourselves. You can fast forward. The time notes are in the show notes. So if you want to get to the discussion about Griefaversaries, feel free to fast forward through this. For those of you that feel like you have capacity to hear my story, thank you. It's Sunday, the 17th, and I am re-recording what I had originally recorded for today because I am feeling a different sense of connectedness coming off of the family gathering that we did today. For the past 14 years, we have gathered as a family in memory of my brother. Whether that was a small group of 10 or a big group of 30 plus, we've gotten together to be together on this day that's emotionally hard because my parents and I decided that we didn't want to grieve in isolation and grieve alone. The very first year we did, we were by ourselves. We spent the day together, and honestly, it really sucked. It was hard. I had heard some of my other cousins got together, and we were processing the evening with one of my aunts, and she shared about how they would have loved to show up for us that day. So that's what we decided to do moving forward, is we were going to gather together to remember Garrett on the 18th. For the most part, we've been able to. There's a local pizza place that usually was the host for our gatherings, and people could come and stay as long as they needed to. We took that moment to acknowledge our grief, to acknowledge that we missed Garrett. That's held a lot of meaning and significance for us, and that we didn't have to be alone on this really hard day. My brother passed away pretty traumatically, and so we didn't get a chance to say goodbye. And it's almost like every year on the anniversary, at least for me, I can't speak for my parents, but it's like a cold bucket of water dumped on my head, reminding me of the depth of pain I felt on this day, that feeling that my life wasn't ever going to be the same. Because with sibling loss, as I talked about on a previous episode, that's someone we expect to grow old with, that we're going to spend the rest of our lives with. I don't get to have that experience, and it sucks. It's really hard. I get jealous of my cousins who do have siblings that are still alive, because I see how they have supported one another in all of these life milestones, through marriages, through becoming parents, through helping support aging parents in that sandwich generation situation. At times overwhelming for me, and that I'm doing that by myself without my brother. We were really close. We looked out for each other. We stood up for each other. He was a really good human. And I am feeling particularly grateful for the gathering we had this year, because we did it a little different than we have in the past. We didn't gather at a restaurant. We didn't gather at like a different family member's home. We went to my home. We went to my childhood home. My parents brought out the pictures from the celebration of life. We had a big portrait of him from camping, because he loved camping and being outdoors. And we had the remnants of the collage. We had 2 collage poster boards at the celebration of life. We've taken pictures off of them over the years. And so we were able to put together the remnants of one, and I'll make sure to put that. I took a picture of it, and I'll make sure to put that in the show notes for people to see. There's an interesting story with the collage photos, and it made me chuckle because I talked about it in the original attempt at recording this episode, because when we were planning his celebration of life, it made some poster boards with some collage photos on, just with glue and tape. So very old school. It wasn't printed. It wasn't fancy, but we wanted to have pictures of him. And so I remember I had a huge meltdown because I didn't feel like there were enough pictures on the poster board. I wanted more. When I think about that memory now, it has this dual meaning for me. It wasn't that I necessarily wanted more pictures on the poster board. I wanted the opportunity to take more pictures in the future, and I wasn't going to get that. So it was really interesting to me that my folks had brought out the poster boards and the pictures, and it made me so happy seeing those memories of when we were kids and the different people that he was in relationship with and connected with and built memories with during his time here. And I loved seeing that again. And then something we did differently this time than we have in the past is we asked people to think of a story to share. We went around and shared stories in a very intentional way. Being in our home, which is where he died, and being surrounded by pictures of him felt really different this year. And getting to hear people's stories and adding to that collective memory of him was so powerful. Everyone was crying at some point, whether it was when they were sharing versus when they were listening. Even his best friend from childhood came. And that was such a gift because a lot of my cousins and aunts and uncles saw him at family gatherings, which is a very different aspect, if not totally different, but different enough aspect from when he was with his closest friends doing shenanigans. We grew up in a really small town, middle of nowhere, not a lot to do. And so he got into a lot of mischief with his group of friends. And so getting to hear some of those stories was wonderful. And also just the depth of impact that he made on his group of friends, that they still think of him, remember him, treasure him. Felt so good to see that we're not the only ones still remembering him. Because I still miss him every day. I miss him when I see silly things my kids do. He would have loved to be part of that, part of those adventures and stories and being an uncle. It was cool hearing some of my younger cousins share, because there was about a 10-year age gap between my gen of cousins and then the younger cousins. And just hearing some of their stories today, remembering how inclusive he was of the younger cousins and always made space, it just felt so good to hear those stories. Growing up, my brother and I were really close. We were 22 months apart, and I remember hearing stories, because I don't necessarily remember this when I was little. He was really shy and reserved, and I was not. I was quite vocal as a kid, and we'd go to restaurants and he'd be shy, and I would order for him, and I always did my best to try to stand up for him as a big sister. And I loved my little brother. We would play video games and board games. We'd be super competitive. We were both athletes. We did tennis and basketball. He did some other sports. I did some other sports, but those were the two that we did in common. We'd play basketball, especially, a lot together. We'd play in the woods. I grew up in the woods. I grew up on 5 acres. And during one season of hobbies, Garrett was really into paintball. And so him and his friends and my dad, they spent like a weekend. It might have been a couple weekends. This was a long time ago, so the details are slightly blurry, but they cleared out some trails so that there could be a paintball course on our back acres. And they built bunkers and lookouts, and we had these giant, like styrofoam shipping container sized cubes. And then he and his friends would play paintball. He just always had so many different hobbies and interests, and at the end of the day, we enjoyed spending time together. I remember that summer before I went to college, he'd always come and hang in my room, and we'd watch old Disney movies and just lots of nostalgia, and just tried to spend a lot of quality time together. I remember we always went to each other's sporting events growing up. We were a pretty tight-knit little family, and my brother was the humor diffuser. Whenever there was tension or if parents were fighting, like, he'd make a funny sound effect or say a joke or distract, and it just always lightened the mood. He was so funny, so sarcastic, so kind. Yeah, he loved to show up for the people in his life. I think I've mentioned on a previous episode, I went to Gonzaga in Spokane, Washington for my undergrad degree, and he went to Eastern Washington, which was in Cheney. It's about a 30-ish minute drive. I was a junior when he was a freshman, and we'd go on dates. And I'd go pick him up at his dorm, and we'd go into Spokane and we'd go to like dinner and a movie. We would go get pierced. We got our industrials pierced together. I remember he got his lobes pierced on one of our dates and then started getting them gauged. He was great. And he'd really cheer on people when they were down or stuck or struggling. Like, he really tried to support and uplift and encourage. And even though I was the older sister, he definitely gave me my fair share of pep talks. I struggled a lot with insecurity and confidence. And some of those pep talks I can still hear in my head. And I try to pull those out when I'm afraid, when I'm struggling, when I don't know how to handle a situation. I try to think, what would Garrett have told me to do? The month before he died, one of my best friends from college had come over for her birthday, and we went out with my cousins that night. And I remember, and we made it back to my parents' house, and I think I'd gone downstairs to get some water and ran into him. And I remember we were sitting on the couch. I told him, I love you no matter what, right? Regardless of what's going on. Like, that will never change. I will always love you and show up for you. And that memory has been a deep point of comfort for me, knowing that in less than a month after that conversation, he was gone. And knowing that he knew how I felt about him, I feel like that's a gift that I got to have that conversation and have that fun memory of that night with him. He taught us all how to do the Cupid Shuffle and serenaded Don't Stop Believin', which is one of my go-to songs when I'm missing him, or one of those signs that I've seen over the years, like I'm in a bad mood or something really hard's happening, and I turn on the radio and that song is there, and it's almost like his little, hey, I see you. 10 out of 10 recommend short story sharing at Griefaversary if that feels good for you and your family. There's not one right way to do a Griefaversary. I am just sharing my own experience and what has felt good for me and my family, and that might be different than what feels good for you and yours. I just want to normalize and validate that you get to choose what feels best for you and your family. Feeling super grateful and feel like my cup is full and ready for tomorrow, which is the actual anniversary. I got to do some really good self-care in the build up to the anniversary, which I, again, 10 out of 10 recommend. Having that coping ahead plan for bigger, griefier days is really important. For me, I did some acupuncture on Friday, which is something that's really helpful for me. I discovered that when I was pregnant with my daughter, it helped a lot with hip pain, and I've just maintained that from a body health perspective. That's been really healing for me. I know not everybody's a fan of needles, and again, not going to try to encourage you to do something that doesn't feel right for you. I got to go for a 6 a.m. walk with a friend, and that felt amazing to feel so seen by someone who loves me, understands grief, has experienced their own loss. And so getting to have that intentional time to move my body in a way that felt good with someone I feel really emotionally safe with was really healthy and healing for me. And then getting to have today with my family and laughing and crying and connecting. We live in an unincorporated county, and my brother really liked fireworks. We made a sparkler bomb to stick in a decomposing pumpkin, and so we blew the pumpkin up, and it was so fun and silly. It made us all think of him. It was something he really was into. Anyways, just feeling so grateful that I get to share about him with you. It means a lot getting to have this space. When we think about Griefaversaries and how grief changes over time, I think the thing to remember is that grief doesn't go away. It just gets different. And as time moves on, it matters what you do with that time. So if you have been ignoring your grief for a year, for 5 years, for 10 years, for 30 years, that's still in you. You're still carrying it. And so being mindful that in order for your grief to feel different, you need to start doing things differently. Whether that's going to therapy, doing a support group, whether that's write about it, being curious and creative about what is going to feel most honoring to you in your story and the person that you lost is really important, especially knowing that on the harder days during the year, whether it's their birthday, your wedding anniversary, the Griefaversary, the day they passed. It could be a diagnosis day. There was a cancer diagnosis or another chronic health diagnosis. And that was a really hard day, knowing that there was only so much time or that there was going to be a beginning of a decline. Those can all be days that pack a punch. Making that plan ahead to care for yourselves, knowing that you don't know how your emotions are going to show up on the actual day. So maybe not overscheduling yourselves, planning self-care things, planning extra sleep, being really protective of rest. But maybe you feel better being busy. So maybe you want to fill your schedule more because that helps you feel more supported being around people. Whereas for me, I like to be around people a little bit, and I also know I need time to rest and recharge by myself. And that's what feels good for me. So figuring out that balance and knowing it's okay to be messy with it. It's okay to not have it perfectly figured out that first time or that fifth time or that 15th time. Because our needs change over time. We are not stagnant beings. So being intentional about, okay, that I remember that felt really good last year. I'm going to try that again. Or that felt terrible. I'm going to do something totally different. And giving yourself permission to do different and new things. So whether that's getting out of town, maybe you don't want to be in familiar settings when you're on your grief anniversary. Maybe you want to get out of town and you can still do something to honor them, whether that's lighting a candle or listening to one of their favorite songs or eating or cooking one of their favorite meals, watching a movie you guys watch together. There's not one right way to do that or to make a tradition in a way that feels meaningful for you. Because grief anniversaries, the emotions connected to it can sometimes catch us off guard. So not having expectations for yourself and giving yourself permission to change your mind depending on how you feel that day, because you might have a great plan or you might have no plan and decide you want one. It depends. The other piece I think can be important to remember is that sometimes there can be this societal discomfort with grief in general, and also with grief anniversaries. Because we're in this grief phobic society, people don't like talking about death and dying. They are very youth focused, anti-aging, all of that. So when we are confronted with grief anniversaries or anything grief related, some people tend to shy away from that. There can be this tension between wanting to honor the day and also feeling the need to be in a different space, when really it's like we don't need to be anywhere than where we are. We get to show up with our grief however it's showing up today, and that gets to be enough. There's not a wrong way to do this. There's not a race that you're supposed to be running with your grief. There's not a projected timeline of when you're going to feel X, Y, or Z about your loss. It is so personal to you. And there's no shoulds or supposed tos in this process. You get to show up where you're at in that moment. I just encourage you to embrace that rather than shame or judge yourself that you should be someplace else, because your grief is just your grief. They're feelings and you feel them acutely because you loved your person who's no longer here. That makes sense to me. Something I encourage with my clients about grief anniversaries, and it can be really helpful to think about our rituals you want to do around that day. Whether that's writing your loved one a letter, updating them on things that have been going, sending them a voice memo if writing isn't your jam, thinking of ways to say hello again if it's been a while since you've talked to them, doing small things that feel meaningful, allow for that ritual, that memorializing. Maybe you go to the graveside, or they really liked water, so you go for a walk on the beach or sit on a pier and give yourself permission to think about them, to remember those special moments. I think those things are really important. Another thing to think about is how anniversaries can change over time. The first 5 years were a mess. I felt them so acutely. It just didn't feel real that he wasn't going to just drive up in his Subaru, walk through the door, and say, sorry guys, don't know where the time went. Those first 5 years were really hard, really challenging, really overwhelming from a grief standpoint. The next few years felt a little different. It didn't feel as acute. I still missed him. I still miss him every day. Over time, it changes. I think having awareness of different stressors and different capacity for our grief. Like capacity and time are resources we need to think about when we're grieving. Depending on what else is going on around you, you may not have the time that you need to grieve in the way that you would like to. And that gets to be okay. You carry it with you until you have the time to grieve in the way that you want to do the rituals that you need to, whether that's a week later, 2 weeks later, a month later. No one is keeping track of when you choose to honor your loved one and honor your grief. And I think giving ourselves permission to be flexible, because again, we don't always have the privilege or the resources to grieve in the way that we want to. And so I think over time, as life grows and keeps moving forward, it's okay if how your grief shows up for you. I think about, I lost my grandma Story in 2016 and loved her. She was one of my favorite humans in the world. I'd go and visit and we'd take naps and eat snacks. She'd always have lots of stories to share and was a really warm, loving human. And that first year after she passed on the Griefaversary, I got together with 3 of my other cousins and we went to Flo Anna's, which is this little local diner off Lake City Way that she always took us to. We all have a core memory from Flo Anna's growing up. That was just what she did. We got club sandwiches and we did that first year and it felt so good. We talked all about grandma, silly memories and childhood things, just how she would have loved to see all the new great grandkids. It was really cool. We haven't done it since. We did it the first year because that's what we needed and that felt good. And then years since, we haven't. Like, we maybe texted one another, thinking of you, thinking of grandma today. It's not as acute of a loss as with my brother because different losses feel differently. And that gets to be okay. And again, the needs of the Griefaversary has changed over time. And so giving yourself permission to change what you need as you go. It's okay to rewrite the rules for yourself. To summarize today's episode, first off, thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being on this journey with me. This is episode 38, which is wild. I started this in February of this year, and I never thought I would make it this far. I just feel so honored. The people that I've gotten to meet, the fellow grief warriors that we are all working together to advocate for a better way of grieving, to help with normalizing mourning and loss, and that it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to talk about our people and want others to ask us about them and have better language for sharing about our grief and better understanding of how much it impacts us on a day-to-day basis. Thank you for being on this griefy journey with me. I hope you found today's episode helpful as you think about your own upcoming Griefaversaries. And again, just the biggest takeaway is that there's not one right way to grieve. There's not one right way to do this. And you are doing a good job with the tools and resources you have. It's okay to invite people into this grief space with you, and it's okay to change your mind. Stay tuned for more episodes. I'm excited to see how this podcast is going to grow and the community that we can build. Also, small shout out, I have a grief journal coming out at the end of this month. It's called Grief Without Apology. It's a reflective grief journal, and I'm super excited. It'll be out on the 29th. Yay! And yeah, follow along on YouTube or Instagram at Grief is the New Normal. And remember to be kind to yourselves today, especially with the upcoming holiday season. And I'll chat with you guys next time. Take care. That's all for today's episode of Grief is the New Normal. If today's conversation resonated with you, I invite you to share it with someone who might need it. And if you're looking for more support or resources, feel free to head over to The Morning Movement, where we continue to build community and normalize these hard, beautiful parts of life. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, and until next time, be kind to yourself. Opening and closing music is provided by the Datacorns. If you're interested in being a guest on the podcast, collaboration, or training opportunities, feel free to email me at hello@griefisthenewnormal.com. And podcasts are also now available streaming on YouTube.